How's everything for you?
Well, thanks for being with us, and welcome to Off Script, which is NPR's series of conversation with Democratic candidates and voters from across the country. I'm Scott Simon, and today we're in South Bend, Indiana, with the mayor of this city, Pete Buttigieg. Thanks for being with us, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Welcome to South Bend.
And we're at a breakfast and lunch spot.
That's right.
A diner called Peg's. You guys chose to meet here. What does Peg's mean to you?
Peg's is a great hangout, one of many places downtown we're proud of, and one of the first to open some years ago at a time when we were just beginning to see glimmers of life in our downtown, but there wasn't much going on. So Peg's had a lot of confidence in our city, saw that it could grow, and we want to make sure we repay that with support for small businesses like this one.
And what do you like to order here?
There's something called Peg's Eggs, which is eggs on a bed of spinach. It lets you get your protein, but you feel like you're kind of behaving at the same time because of the spinach. So that's my go-to.
The spinach makes it much healthier.
Yeah, spinach makes everything
Yeah.
okay. You get a little bacon on there, it's still okay because you had the spinach.
I had a question for you. I don't want to avoid the fact that if you were to be elected, it would be a real milestone in American history. You would be the first Maltese American to be president of the United States.
It's true. It turns out leaning on the Maltese American vote doesn't get you that big in terms of numbers, but there's a
You don't have it sewn up?
passionate few.
You have it sewn up? You think?
I'd better. I hope so. There's not that many of us.
We want to introduce our two guests who've joined us here. We're with Michael Logan, a retired former Michigan State Police Sergeant. Thank you for being with us, Sergeant. He's the father of three, 54 years old. I don't know why they have to put that in the notes, but thank you very much. And lives just across the state line, the Indiana-Michigan state line. And we also have Jackie Stahl. She's marketing director for a healthcare group here in South Bend, originally from Washington State, and you have a 5-year-old son.
I do.
And both of you say you're undecided voters, right?
Yes.
Absolutely.
We're going to ask serious, substantial, issue-oriented questions, but I wondered if you had anything else on your mind you'd like to ask Mayor Buttigieg to begin with.
I had a question, Mayor Pete.
Yeah.
What's your favorite sport and why?
It's football because I grew up going to games with my dad and when you're in South Bend, I think you're either a football fan or you're contrarian. And I grew up as a football fan.
College football.
And I could never get myself to care about pro ball that much because Notre Dame loomed so large.
Sure.
How about you?
College.
Okay.
Absolutely.
There you go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Notre Dame kind of is pro ball, isn't it?
Yeah. They have their own TV contract. They make their own schedule, 30 years in advance. So.
Yeah, exactly. Jackie, did you have any question for the mayor?
I guess the question I have is, you're gone so much, so what do you miss the most about being away?
Well, certainly just the basics, the house, the dogs, being able to cook a home-cooked meal or more realistically help Chasten cook and then enjoy a home-cooked meal. But, when we're home, we make the most of it. And this is a good town, especially in fall. You feel just how much warmth and life there is to this city. And, I love my experiences on the road, but definitely miss home.
Jackie, you've got questions about the mayor's health care platform. He's talked about Medicare for all who want it. Let me get you to address your questions to the mayor, because you have direct personal experience working in the healthcare industry.
I do. Personally, professionally. So with healthcare, Medicare for all, I think there's three big things in healthcare that, I would like to know more your stance on is cost, transparency, and trust from the American people. Right now, those are huge issues. I think the first question I want to ask is cost-wise. Personally, my son has a condition where his medication costs up to $35,000 a month. He is, has quality of life. He's a, normal 5-year-old kid. But without that, that's how much it's going to cost. How do we get the cost down? Are we going to be helping that?
Well, it's such a central question that I think gets missed because all the political excitement is around the Medicare for all versus who want it versus other models. And you're right, the cost question is so central. So I think, first of all, we need to unlock the negotiating power of the United States of America. There's just no good reason, in my view, why Medicare is prevented from negotiating the prices of therapies and of drugs with the pharmaceutical companies. companies. And the way I would set it up would be that you would not only have that kind of negotiating power for Medicare and for the public plan that I'm proposing that we create, but also under certain circumstances, make it possible for the department to negotiate on behalf of private plans. Now, this is not about punishing any pharmaceutical company that's doing the right thing. We're glad that they're creating these drugs and these therapies. It makes obviously a huge difference and can be life-saving. But sometimes the costs we're seeing are not driven just by the economics of what it takes to create these therapies. A lot of companies charge outrageous prices because they can. And so there does need to be a regulation side to this. I'm proposing that we not allow prices to rise faster than inflation, unless there's some really extraordinary reason. There might be a situation where there's a shortage of some key ingredient or something like that. But under ordinary circumstances, if the price is rising faster than inflation, there would be a strong enough penalty on the company to discourage them from doing that. We also need to make sure that we use the purchasing power to make sure that those volume discounts of having the federal government doing those purchases kick in. And we've got to make sure we're on the lookout for gouging that often goes on and policing that with a whole set of tools in the toolkit to make sure that when companies do engage in unethical behavior, that there's accountability for that.
Right, absolutely. I think, for his condition, there's a cure out there. Gene therapy is coming, it's in the works, but, it could be a few $1 million to get that done for him. So there's a cure in our grasp, but will we ever be approved to even have that in our future? So.
Can I ask, does your healthcare coverage take care of the cost of those therapies?
It does.
Or?
Thankfully, we do. But, we have that, but also there's a burden on us if anything else goes wrong. Like, I avoid health care because I want to make sure that my son has the means. And then also you have to look at my employer who is, we're self-insured. So they have to pick up the cost somewhere. So it's just, there's no right answer anywhere from getting away from those costs.
No, Jack, you also work in the healthcare industry. And you see firsthand, both in your experience and your family and also working in the healthcare industry, how you really have to maneuver to be able to know how to take care of yourself, don't you? And make hard choices sometimes.
Yes, absolutely. My CEO and I were joking because we work in healthcare, yet it's so difficult to navigate healthcare, and we're in it. And so, how do you think the average American, and why does it have to be so complicated? So many times we see patients that do the right steps to make sure that they're in network and that everything is covered by their insurance, but yet they have a surprise bill of $300 or thousands of dollars. Right. That has to stop. How do we get that to stop?
Right. Well, and another thing we're proposing is to end surprise billing. So we would set 200% of Medicare would be the highest that even an out-of-network therapy could cost when you have a hospitalization or something like that. Because, some of this is also the responsibility of hospitals and healthcare providers. This can't just be handled on the insurance side. Now, we want hospitals to grow, and we want, providers to do well, and we can do that in a way that also manages these costs. But it sure will help, I think, if we can take steps like what I'm proposing with Medicare for All Who Want It to make sure everybody's covered and no one's falling through the cracks, because then we're more likely to see an evening out of the radically different prices that can be attached to the same procedure or the same bit of medication, depending where you are in our current patchwork of coverage.
Right. Well, one question on a little statistics on you talk about hospitals. An article just came out about a month ago from Ball State from a professor talking about the cost of healthcare in Indiana and how about 20 years ago, the Hoosiers were paying about $313 less than the average American. Now we are paying $816 more than the average American. And it kind of boils down to these nonprofit hospitals, which don't pay taxes, but yet nonprofit hospitals are the most profitable industry in the state of Indiana. I work for Independent Physician Group, which our goal is to, one, make healthcare simpler and to lower the cost of healthcare. An example of that is we have an imaging center. We're outpatient, so an MRI could cost, without using insurance, because people are avoiding that because deductibles are so high, $600 for an MRI. Where you go to a hospital, it's double, triple the cost. And consumers don't understand that. So there is that transparency, cost, trust, all of that. I think that's so important, and that's what needs to be addressed.
And how would you address it, do you think?
Well, the point you make about transparency, I think, is really important. So we also need to encourage and press providers to just reveal what the prices even are, which can be shockingly difficult to get a hold on. And if we're thinking about the same study, I think it was Michael Hicks who published this. Another effect, if I recall right, that we saw there was that there's a lot of consolidation going on.
Yes.
And the more the providers consolidate, the more hospitals, for profit as well as nonprofit, are consolidating, the less options there are. And so it's another reason why, in the same way that we keep an eye on monopolies in the telecom industry or in the agriculture industry, we've also got to have the right kind of enforcement tools to make sure that if you do have consolidation of hospitals or major providers, that they have to demonstrate that it's not going to create an upward pressure on prices.
Right, absolutely.
Let me ask a question, Mr. Mayor, to follow up. There are lots of ambitious healthcare plans that have been proposed in this campaign alone. Can you get yours passed? Because that's kind of the acid test, isn't it?
It is. I mean, the reality is all these beautiful proposals we all put forward, their impact is kind of multiplied by zero if you can't actually get it through Congress. And it's one of the reasons why I do favor the approach that I have, what we call Medicare for all who want it. We create a public plan, Medicare type plan for every American, and we make sure that everybody can afford it. But we don't require you to take it. And partly I think that's just the right policy because I think people should be able to choose. But it's also really important that that's a policy that commands the support of most Americans, which, by the way, is a big deal because this would be the biggest innovation, the biggest move forward in healthcare in about 50 years. But we have a moment where we can get something that big done and most Americans want it done. That's not true of some of the other ideas out there, which would make it much harder to actually achieve them, no matter how good they sound in campaign season.
Michael, we want to move on to your questions. Do you want to talk to the mayor about trade with China and how what effect tariffs have had in Michigan and Indiana and elsewhere?
Yeah, my family and I, we live in St. Joseph, and you're familiar with St. Joe. We just live south of there. So we live in a country setting. We're surrounded by farms. There's some farmers. I just was talking to a farmer a couple weeks ago, specifically pertaining to the tariffs. And he's a soy farmer, and he was telling me that his soy, even though he's gotten federal subsidies because now he would send a majority of his soy to Asia. Now they're not accepting that soy because of the tariffs, but even though he's getting subsidies, that's fine for this year. But his concern is, what about next year or the year after? Because he's sort of hedging his bet that the tariff issue will address itself or work its way out by this time next year, which will resolve his soy issue. But if it doesn't, then what does he do? Huh? And that's just a microscopic issue with him. And I'm sure that there are hundreds of thousands of farmers across the nation who are experiencing the same thing. And there's nothing he can really do about it. He's just hoping that President Trump will do the right thing and address these tariffs and come to some type of resolution. Otherwise, he not only now has to deal with the unexpected nature of Mother Nature, which he has no control over. Now he has to deal with a president who has made these poor decisions that we do sort of have some control over. Yeah. So how would you address those issues with not only him, but the other millions of farmers across the nation?
Yeah, I think what you're describing is really the predicament that so many farmers are in. And the more you talk to, certainly the more I talk to farmers, the more you realize they do math for a living. They deal with uncertainty for a living. They're figuring out uncertainty around the weather, uncertainty around the yields, around the prices, right? Figuring out when to buy their supplies and when to sell their product. And now the president has created this new enormous source of uncertainty on top of all the risks they're already trying to deal with. And the soybean case is maybe the main example of how this trade war is coming down on the backs of farmers. And those basically bailout funds that have come out. I talked to a lot of farmers who say, first of all, it hasn't made them whole. It's taken the edge off, but it's not made them whole. And they would rather just be selling their product and succeeding. One said to me, I'd rather be using those kinds of funds for conservation, which is another thing we could be doing with those billions of dollars if it weren't for the harm that's happening to farmers because of the trade war. So first rule, do no harm. This is not even part of a trade strategy with China. It's just a pattern of poking them in the eye to see what will happen. Of course, what happens is they poke back, and the harm of that comes down on farmers, also consumers. A lot of our prices, more than people may realize, are going to go up because of the tariffs. Just stuff that we're used to getting when we go shopping, to the tune of hundreds of dollars for a typical American family. So what do we do about it? Well, first of all, we've got to reset our trade relationship with China. And that doesn't mean that we just open it all up. We do have to take steps to make sure that the future of the relationship with China is a competition where our farmers, our workers, and our consumers can do well. We're not just going to slap tariffs for the hell of it and see what will happen. We have to make sure that where we have the most aggressive approach is on areas where we're concerned about being too intimately connected. I'm thinking about things like electronics, where, frankly, we need to be careful about how reliant we are, just for security reasons. And we want to see a greater degree of openness in areas where we have a lot to export, like soybeans, like pork, and make sure that this is part of a bigger strategy. By the way, dealing with a country that is famous for doing their own strategy and planning in 10 or 20 or even 50-year terms, which means that we also need to set up a framework that can make sense past an individual presidency. So I think that needs to be the basis of our trade strategy. And, it needs to be the basis of our overall economic pictures. Is it working for farmers? Is it working for consumers? Is it working for workers? Otherwise, it's not working. No matter how good the stock market numbers look, if most of us aren't feeling like we're doing better, then I don't think it's a success.
How do you change? Because that trade relationship with China is decades in the making.
Yeah.
So the United States is heavily relying upon our trade partnership with China both ways.
Yeah.
I think we're more heavily relying on them than they are us. So after this relationship has sort of been cemented for the last 50 years, how do you slowly or as quickly as possible change that so now we're benefiting more from the trade than they are?
So I think it has to be based on the areas of mutual benefit. Otherwise, we shouldn't even be doing it, right? And by the way, farming is one of them. It's one of those where they've got a need, and we've got goods we're ready to export. And it's okay to be importing too, as long as it all balances out in a way that benefits us. I think the cornerstone of the relationship has to be that we have common interests, both in some areas of economics and in security. Now, they are a competitor in some ways, even may shape up with the shape of a strategic adversary in some ways, but not in others. We both have an interest in stability. We both have an interest in peace. I think in the long run, we both have an interest in North Korea moving into a more normal relationship with the community of nations, which means denuclearization and peace with South Korea. There are a lot of steps we can take that would be mutually beneficial. Other areas, we're going to need to take a tougher stance. You would not see me promising, for example, to be quiet about democracy in Hong Kong as a way to make a trade deal go through, because those are our values. And I think if we don't have our values at our back, people are not going to know what to expect from America. We'll just be another country out there. What makes America America is that we operate not only based on our interests, but based on our values. And the beauty is, because our values are shared around the world, that actually winds up helping our interests too.
Michael, can I ask a follow-up question to the mayor?
Absolutely.
You put human rights into the conversation, which interests me, because so much of the conversation we have about U.S.-China trade seems to be just about economics. But as we know, there are more than 1 million Uyghur Muslims who are imprisoned in a part of China. There's the crackdown in Hong Kong. There's, I don't know, dozens, hundreds of dissidents that are at the moment being jailed in China. Is it worth it to open that up with China and use trade as a lever to try and get them to improve their human rights policies?
I think it is. I think it's part of a bigger picture. So there are a lot of moving pieces here. But we know that there are trade outcomes that they care about, and there are human rights outcomes that are beneficial for the world, beneficial for the people impacted, whether it's religious minorities or those seeking democracy, and beneficial for the U.S. Doesn't mean we have to come raging in, demanding regime change. We've seen how that works out. But it does mean that we can at least include it in the big picture as one of the things we care about, one of the things we're pushing for in the bigger context, and certainly not promising to be silent about even moral support when, as this president apparently did in the context of Hong Kong, when, again, so much of what helps us carry weight in the wider world is the fact that we do, in fact, at least at our best moments as a country, represent something bigger than ourselves, which is a commitment to democracy and human rights.
Michael, I want to get you, I know you want to raise some questions that are kind of drawn from your background in law enforcement.
Absolutely.
And how the mayor intends to address those issues.
The last 4 years I spent as a detective sergeant with the state police, and I worked in the city of Benton Harbor, and you're very familiar with Benton Harbor, to assist them with their violent crimes. Growing up in the Detroit area, it's a large metropolitan area. One of the things that I saw almost immediately in my career early in law enforcement, and especially now at the end working in Benton Harbor, was the need for law enforcement to actively engage with the underrepresented community, and not just specifically African American, Hispanic, Muslim, any underrepresented community, because that has an immediate, from what I've seen, has an immediate long-term effect on people's behavior and cultural change. What's your plan? And I'm not speaking specifically in reference to Eric Logan or any other incident that involves law enforcement.
He was the man who was killed during the summer here in South Bend.
Yes. Not specifically that, but just the overall relationship between law enforcement and communities of color. Do you have a plan on how to address that, to improve that relationship between those two entities?
Yes, and this is one element of the Douglas plan that I've put forward on tearing down different areas of institutional and systemic racism in the U.S., but it's also got to just be viewed as part of a public safety plan. One of the things that I think we see here and in a lot of other areas is when you have a wall of mistrust between communities of color and between law enforcement, it makes it a lot harder for law enforcement to successfully do their job. It makes things more dangerous, especially as we see more and more young people, shockingly young people, teenagers, involved in gun crime. If somebody who is close to a victim doesn't go to law enforcement, that usually means they're going to take things in their own hands, and then you see these cycles of violence pick up. So police legitimacy and these relationships are important, I think, not only from the perspective of racial justice, but from the perspective of public safety itself. What can we do about it? Well, one thing we know is we can promote programs that encourage that kind of relationship that officers uniquely are able to build in communities of color and on the ground. I always like to say that officers do best when they have the mentality almost of somebody like a candidate for city council. In other words, wanting to walk the neighborhood, build relationships, be viewed as a community problem solver. And we can do everything from citizens police academies. We got one of those that encourages just residents to take a sort of a light schedule classes to learn about how law enforcement works, to programs that get officers working with kids in athletic leagues and those kinds of things, so that early in life there are those mentoring relationships. I want to make sure that for any kid in our community or in our country, the first interaction they have with a law enforcement officer is not in the context of a call or an arrest, but on a good day, so that relationship, so that how they view the uniform can develop. And we also, of course, need to make sure that we have more diverse officers on the department, which frankly has become harder, I think, since Ferguson. We're finding it harder and harder to find, in particular, young black men who can picture themselves in uniform. But you need a department that looks like the communities that it serves. And so anything that we can do.
This department has been criticized for that under your
Yeah, we've had a real
stewardship,
struggle with
hasn't
that during my time as mayor, and it's happening in South Bend, but not only South Bend. It's really a national challenge. But I think partnerships with HBCUs can help build up diverse pathways into policing. And by the way, for the same reason, I think it's so important for people with diverse backgrounds and different ideological backgrounds to seek not only to be public defenders, but to be prosecutors. And I've been excited to see more people interested in that. So those are some of the steps that we can encourage from a federal level that I think support departments that really depend on those community relationships that have come under such strain.
Former sergeant, how does that strike you? Is this the kind of stuff you've heard from public officials before, or is there a nugget of something else there?
No, I think that, Mr. Mayor, I think that's a great idea. But I honestly don't. I honestly am curious as how that's sustainable, because you've seen programs over the year whether it's DARE, keep kids off, say no to drugs.
Right.
All of those are very short-term solutions, and they're slogan-based, and those programs were effective for a very short period of time. But in terms of the communities of color, there has to be a cultural, a true cultural shift, and I don't think that. Well, that's not true. I think that there's a way to do that, but it has to be continuous and it has to be sustained, not only over a 2-year period, but in terms of contacting children and building relationships and mentoring and coaching in the 3rd and 4th grade, and then following those kids throughout their entire public school or private school time. And you won't see the results of that for 6 or 7 years. How do you address that? Because it's really a cultural change, because me as a police officer going into a school and speaking to someone maybe Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and I'm there for 3 or 4 hours, which is fantastic. When they leave, what they're being exposed to is vastly different than, Mike Logan being at their school and sitting down with them and reading and talking to them. How do you offset that over a long period of time? And the second part of that is then, if you do that nationally, who pays for it?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it's worth investing federal dollars in this, even if it's expensive. So that gets to who pays for it. But I also really agree that we're talking about deep, interwoven cultural issues here. And sometimes these issues are laid at the feet of law enforcement. Really, it's about a lot of different things. It's about everything from economic empowerment to education. A lot of times it's also about whether we are responding to mental health and disability issues in the right way, because we've seen a lot of racial disparity in that almost forces people or routes them toward the criminal justice system at a young age, when we really could be finding another way to handle people. So I don't want all of this to be kind of pinned on the law enforcement side of the house, but it is clear that there's a lot more we can do. And I also think this is why it would be a good idea to have a national police academy in the same way that we have a West Point for the Army or a Annapolis for the Navy, that really builds out what the future of policing is going to look like, and trains people not just in sort of tactics, but in these kind of cultural questions, because they are going to need some leadership from, I think, within the profession. It can't all just be something that is kind of pushed on law enforcement frankly, by politicians, even as we try to do our work to promote things moving in the right direction.
How does that strike you?
I think that's a great idea. But again, the question is always going to be, and I know you can't answer this right now, Mr. Mayor, how it's funded. Because honestly, most people, unless they're directly affected by what's going on, it's sort of the mentality of, well, what happens on the south side of south side of South Bend, it doesn't affect me, so why should I really care? Even though the exact opposite, you really should care, because you mentioned it earlier when you were talking about the healthcare. This is about all of us, and all of us benefit from helping everyone else. So that's the biggest issue that I see with that is, it's just human nature. Some people believe that as long as it doesn't affect me, then that's sort of their problem. And it's really not at all. It's everyone's problem.
That's true.
And Mr. Mayor, people don't say, "Oh yeah, please let me pay more taxes." I would welcome the opportunity to pay for a national police academy.
Yeah, but here's the thing: we need to do some of this work, and as a country, I think over my lifetime, we have seen the consequences of disinvesting, taking money out of education, out of infrastructure, out of health, and mostly using it not to spend on other priorities, with the exception of wars, some of which could have been avoided. But a lot of it was spent just to cut taxes, and it was to cut taxes on the wealthiest, who needed it the least. Look, things cost money. You can't get something for nothing, but there's a way to do this without going back to the tax levels we saw in the 60s in the U.S. But it is going to require asking some to do more, in particular corporations that right now can make billions of dollars and pay literally zero in federal income taxes. And we can't expect to thrive or to grow in safety and health, in education, in any of the things that make America successful and competitive, if we're not willing to gather that revenue and put it to good use.
Jackie, do you have any questions for the mayor on this line?
I don't think
All right.
so.
I wanted to get to something else I know concerns you, Michael. I know that you're concerned about the general level of conversation we have in this country, in public.
Civility, yes.
Civility. All right. I was trying to avoid the word because people think that's a code word for not saying what you mean nowadays. But please address your concern to the mayor about that.
How do we go? I think there's always been a level of civility. What whether it was presented to the public as being civil, and I'm sure in the background, in the back rooms, and I'm sure it probably wasn't so much so, which is fine, because I think that's where you should figure it all out. And, when it's presented to the voting public, then it's, more civil. We can agree to disagree. How do we get back, and it changed very drastically since President Trump has been elected. There's the level of civility is almost gone, completely gone. And I think because he is a leader, he's really the leader of the free world and absolutely the leader of this country. With that lack of civility, he's given people the license to sort of say and do things that they can do and say, but they really shouldn't. And now he's given people the license to do just that. I was in Panera Bread in St. Joe a few weeks ago, and an elderly gentleman came in. He had on a Make America Great hat. Seemed like a nice guy. Came in and ordered, and a couple of 20-some-year-old kids came in after him, and they walked past him and turned around and looked at him. And I'm sure they don't know this gentleman. And they made a comment about his hat and told him to take his hat off, and you shouldn't be here with that hat on. And it's a very small example, but I think the nation has reached the point where if you can't wear a hat, regardless of what your political affiliation is, without someone confronting you about that, I don't think that atmosphere existed before Donald Trump became president. And I think he's just exasperated it and sort of fueled the fire. How do we get back to the civility?
Yeah, I think a lot of Americans right now are getting ready for Thanksgiving, wondering how the meals conversation is going to go, because these fences have gone up even within families and certainly within communities like what you're describing. And part of what I think we've seen right now is that so much depends on how the president acts and how the president talks. It's not all one person, but an awful lot depends on what the president does. To me, this is one of the things the presidency is for. One of the first things I had to figure out, sometimes the hard way as mayor, is that my job here is not just about policy. It's not just about running the government. It's about setting a tone. And that part of the job, it's not written down anywhere. It's not in the law. It's not in the job description. But it might be where you earn your paycheck the most when you're in charge, because you have a responsibility to make sure even those who don't agree with you, especially those who don't agree with you maybe, feel that they belong to the same thing that you do. In this case, the city. In the president's case, the country. I think the president needs to be a walking symbol of something that we all have in common. Again, not that we agree, but that you have the president for all of us. And I will be very focused. It's part of the idea of my campaign, too, on calling all Americans to be part of this same country, finding ways to express that in what I do, in what I don't do, which I think is a big part of it, and also looking for policy solutions, too. I'll give you an example. I found in the military that I was interacting with people who were so different from me. Different regions, different generation, racially diverse, very different politics. But we learned to trust each other and look out for each other. One of the reasons I'm a big fan of voluntary national service, creating a lot of civilian national service opportunities, is I want more Americans to have those experiences. If we could create 1 million paid national service opportunities a year, first of all, we get a lot of good work done. I mean, there's a lot of work crying out to be done that we could enlist people to do. But also, in the course of that, I think that a lot of people would have a common experience that they could carry with them for the rest of their lives, in the same way that diverse groups of veterans can always kind of talk to each other, joke with each other, bust each other's chops in a way that just kind of brings them together.
That thing in common.
Yeah, and I want more Americans to have that. So some of the, I think, programs and policies will help, but a lot of it, honestly, is just the message you send from that Oval Office. And the message I want to send is, well, we're going to have it out on some policy issues for sure, but at the end of the day, this is one country, and we're in this together.
Can I have a follow-up question? If you became the Democratic presidential nominee, there will be debates, we assume. President Trump, who has said some things we have noted about people at the border, said some things about people who live in African countries, made other remarks that have disparaged other people. You walk out on that stage, do you shake hands with him?
I'll shake hands with him. He's the president of the United States. But doesn't mean I agree with him. Doesn't mean I endorse his any of the things that he has said. And I will confront him on the things that he has said, because it's one thing to have a policy disagreement. It's another to denigrate human beings and to divide Americans against each other, seemingly on purpose for political gain. And I can, we can do that without becoming what we're up against, without emulating what I'm competing against. So it'll be, at least on my end, it will be respectful, but it will be firm.
There would, if you became the nominee, and I think even before that, there'd be a lot of people who say, no, you get punched in the face, you got to punch back.
Well, you're certainly going to push back when somebody does something wrong. When he lies, I'm going to say that it's a lie and say what the truth is. When he does something wrong, I'm going to confront it. There's a way to do that without becoming like him. And it's very important to me. It's not about having an equal but opposite version of Trump. This is about responding to a divider in chief with a message that is firm in our values, strong in our ideas, and capable of bringing more people into that vision of the future than is possible right now when we're so polarized.
Jackie, I know you have some concerns about this too.
Yeah. Actually, Michael and I were talking before this, and really, how do the past 4 years has really become like a mistrust. There's, a lot of disrespect, and it does come from the top. Someone hiding behind a keyboard, sending out Twitter rants in the middle of the night about, whatever, so hateful things. And it just gives the, kind of green light for anyone to do that. And you really have seen the shift over these past 4 years of the hostility, the anger. How do we turn that around? How can you, gain the trust and respect back from people? And, I don't want to be naive, but, have just a more, peaceful United States.
Yeah. I mean, look, there's always going to be challenges and disagreements, but it doesn't have to be like this. It doesn't have to be at each other's throats. And part of it is making sure that we call out to people as people. I'm still thinking about your example, the folks at Panera now, and kind of picturing, chances are that there are things that each of those people would have appreciated about each other if they saw people. But if all you see is a red hat, just like, some folks, all they see is a uniform, and that just immediately decides how people see each other. Some people, all they see is race. All they see is gender. All they see is politics, whatever it is. And we've got to get back to viewing each other as people. So part of it is a call for every American to reach out to somebody they care about who is different from them politically, and not to talk politics, just to talk about whatever it is they appreciate about each other. Part of it, I think, is the need for us to have a common purpose. Often that comes in the course of conflict. America pulls together when we're fighting another country. I don't think it has to be that. I'm thinking about things that we're going to have to fight together, like climate change. Imagine if that felt like a national project, that everybody from a soybean farmer in rural Michigan to an industrial worker here in South Bend to a student or a consumer understood where they fit in that shared national fight to save our future. It's just one example of an area where we can find something bigger than ourselves, be part of it, get to work, and form some sense of common direction while we're at it, even amid all our disagreements and amid all of our divisions.
Do you think that there's something that all Americans today can rally around and agree on? Do you think that exists right now, today? Is there one common goal?
Well, I think to put it simply, we all want to be okay, right? And at the end of the day, that's safety and some level of prosperity. I don't think everybody feels a burning need to become wealthy, but everybody needs to know that they're going to be okay, that they're going to be able to provide for their kids, that they're going to hopefully do better than the generation before them. I think every American wants that, and I'm proposing ways to get there. There can be disagreement on the ways to get there, but if we can at least agree that that's our common purpose, to be physically safe and to make sure that we economically are able to live lives of our choosing, that ought to be something everybody can get behind, even as we're hashing it out over what it's going to take to get there.
When you say physically safe, does that include climate change?
It does. I think climate change is a national security threat. We're seeing more and more intense and frequent extreme weather events. we're seeing more and more communities threatened. I'm not just talking about what's happening with California wildfires or sea level rise on Pacific Islands. I'm talking about right here in South Bend when we had those floods twice in less than 2 years. We had floods that are supposed to happen less than once in a lifetime. So I think that's a security issue. I think doing something about guns is a security issue, in addition to things like dealing with stateless terrorism and making sure that the U.S. is safe from any foreign threat.
Let me try a couple of questions, if I can, of the mayor. The United States is a country with more than 300 million people. It has a budget of hundreds of trillions of dollars. With respect to your service to your country in the reserve and service to the city here as mayor, you have been mayor of a city of about 100,000 people. Do you have the experience to be president of the United States?
Yes. My experience is being on the ground, dealing with the kinds of issues that you deal with in executive leadership and government. Look, I get the daunting nature of the office. It's also the case that none of the candidates for the presidency right now has been president, except one, Donald Trump, who I think is actually the least qualified of all. And, there's something to be said for longevity. I also think there's something to be said for being newer on the scene and not having spent too much time in Washington. I sometimes wonder if I'd be getting that question if I were a member of Congress or the Senate, even at my age. I probably would be less likely to get it. And yet the truth is...
I would ask a first-term member of Congress.
But here's the thing. You could also be a very tenured member of Congress. You could be a very senior senator in the United States and have never in your life been responsible for more than 100 people, depending on what you were doing before. The experience of members of legislatures is to vote on legislation. Very important, but also very different from running a city of any size, which I would argue in America, perhaps especially in a relatively not one of the biggest cities, and certainly not one of the wealthiest cities, gives you a sense of the challenges that are confronting Americans on the ground. There's a lot of South Bends out there. And there's a lot of challenges out there that are of the kind that we're dealing with right here on the ground, from economic development after deindustrialization to racial tension around policing to making sure that we're getting ahead of climate change. That, nobody walks into that Oval Office having been there before on their first day by definition. But of the many experiences that people bring to them, I would say this is as valid as any.
What about foreign policy? You speak to one degree or another several foreign languages, and you've served overseas in the U.S. military, but foreign policy wouldn't seem to be an area where you have a lot of direct experience.
Well, I'd say one of the reasons that I have weighed in more extensively on foreign policy and have built, I think, the strongest foreign policy team of any candidate is that I care deeply about these issues and have seen firsthand through international experience what's at stake in our international relationships. And as somebody who experienced foreign policy in the form of being sent into a war, but also as somebody who experiences it as someone responsible for a city that is impacted by these choices. In other words, I want there to be a foreign policy that makes sense as a kind of foreign policy for places like South Bend, which if we're getting it right on trade, if we're getting it right on security, if we're getting it right on our values, if we're getting it right on immigration, then that benefits our communities. That's the perspective I bring to it. And I'm going to continue to speak on everything from individual regional security issues that I see around the world to the overall direction of what values America ought to promote in our presence in the community of nations.
May I try another question? You are married to a real social media celebrity. Your husband, Chasten, has really taken off. But I have to raise a question with you because I was hoping not to ask anything about orientation. But as you know, there's some polling information recently reported by the New York Times that says the fact that you're a man married to another man might be causing some reservations and misgivings, specifically among African-American voters in South Carolina. The quote that came back in the Times was, marriage should be between Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. Wonder what you would say to voters who have that reservation.
Well, I think that perspective, it's so simplifying and I think not fair to a diversity of views among African Americans and among a lot of people who are Democrats who may have come up in a socially conservative background, but are also on a journey as the country is. Mm-hmm. You know, right here in South Bend, we didn't know what would happen when I came out. We knew it was a fairly democratic city, but also a socially conservative city. I was ready and it was time and we did it in a re-election year and I wound up getting 80% of the vote. Did better that time than I did the first time around. I think the question that voters are asking is, how's my life going to be different if you're president? And in order to earn votes, my job is to go out there and answer that question. And I think a lot of the other stuff falls away if and only if you have a good answer to that question.
Do people who believe that marriage should be between a man and a woman, or have other views about people of different sexual orientation, are they biased? Are they bigoted?
Well, I'm asking them to view things from the perspective of equality, from the perspective of my rights, and also knowing that might be difficult for some people who have seen a shockingly fast pace of change from just a few years ago when they may have been brought up to reject who I am. But I also know that people who struggle to understand what I would consider to be the right view on this issue have compassion. And I'm appealing to their sense of compassion, their sense of fairness, their sense of how they would want someone they love to be treated, in asking them to view it another way.
I want to leave our last questions to our distinguished panel.
All right. One question I have, we have talked about trust a lot. And I think that kind of ties back into healthcare. With healthcare over the last 20 years or so, the trust in the American healthcare system has dropped dramatically. So much we are kind of on the same page as in trust with Russia and Poland. And the American, are just dissatisfied with the American healthcare system. With all these changes, Medicare for all, who want it? How do we, how are you going to implement that? And how are you going to gain the trust for people to utilize the system again? Because again, there are so many people like myself who work in healthcare who, step aside saying, you know what, maybe I don't need that. I could spend my money on groceries versus going to, to get a checkup. But it's necessary so the cost of healthcare don't keep skyrocketing because they're waiting to the last minute.
Right. I think as with all things in life, building trust comes from keeping a promise, delivering, and then getting more trust. One of the things I found right here in South Bend, I got elected mayor. People took a chance on me, and then I had to start delivering. But the more I did deliver, the more people give me the benefit of the doubt on other things and let me try more things to try to guide our city forward. So when it comes to healthcare, the best example I could point to is the Affordable Care Act. Here you have something that was very much not trusted. In fact, it was politically toxic for my party in 2010. And by 2018, even a Republican Congress couldn't vote to get rid of it. Why? Because we did it and it worked. And I think the same is true of what I proposed to set up with Medicare for all who want it. But that's the idea of my approach to doing it, right? Is that we let you decide. And if we're right, then you're going to want it. If you're right, then it's going to have the most attractive coverage for most people. And then the more people use it, the stronger it'll get, the more people will want it. It very well might be the single payer in the end. But I'm not going to prejudge whether it's right for everybody and how long it's going to take to get there.
Michael Logan, do you have any last question for the mayor?
Yeah, just one, Mr. Mayor. If elected, what would be your number one priority on day one after becoming the President of the United States?
Well, so many things are important, demanding action right now that it's tough to narrow it down. But I would say three big things need immediate attention. One of them is climate, because it's threatening our lives. One of them is economic equity, making sure that we can actually get this economy working for everybody, because until we do, I think it undermines everything in our country. And the other that doesn't get a lot of attention is the integrity of our democracy, and that can get action on day one. I'm thinking about how hard it is for some people to vote, to register to vote, the way our districts are drawn, the role of money in politics. Some of these are generational reforms. I believe we ought to have a national popular vote. I get that will take years and years and years to deliver. Other things we could do really quickly, making election day.
It'd take changing the Constitution, too.
Yes, most likely, yeah.
Okay.
but other things we could do very quickly to make Election Day a holiday, to implement automatic voter registration, to make it easier to vote by mail, to make sure that nobody can be denied their legitimate right to vote. And then there's a bunch of stuff in the medium terms. I know that sounds like unglamorous structural policy stuff, but I think every other issue we care about will always be harder to deal with so long as our democracy remains warped in the way that it is now. And so I think that requires action from day one.
I want to thank everyone for being here. Mayor Pete Buttigieg, candidate for the Democratic nomination for president, thank you very much for joining us here. We joined you at Peg's Diner. And thank you mostly to our voters, Michael Logan and Jackie Stahl. Thanks very much for those wonderful questions.
Thank you.
For those of you who are listening on your local member station,